Good morning to those on the West Coast and good afternoon to those on the East Coast. I'm Alec Karakatsanis, president and founder of Impact Justice. I'm based here right now in Oakland, California, and we are thrilled today that you have joined us virtually, either in the live stream or watching this later as a recording, to listen and hear the conversation between our very own Vice President of Innovations, Aissatou Youssef, and Alec, author of Copaganda, a really incredible book building on years of work and research and discussion that he's engaged in. Impact Ideas is our effort to bring discourse and conversation and big ideas to the space. Over time, in the past and in the future, we have engaged in virtual events, at times live events, but always trying to bring big thinkers with big ideas to have really potent, powerful conversations that ultimately make a difference in the world we live in. So I'm going to turn it over to really the host of all of this, Aissatou, and I want to thank you all for being here today.
Thanks so much, Alex. Hi, everybody. My name is Aissatou. As the Vice President of Innovation Programs here at Impact Justice, I work with an amazing group of people on a portfolio of transformational projects that tackle complex social problems from an intersectional perspective. I am based right today, at least, in sunny California, and I'm super excited to be here with you all. So as Alec Karakatsanis said, Alec Karakatsanis is the founder of Civil Rights Corps, an organization that has freed hundreds of thousands of people from confinement in jail cells, reunited hundreds of thousands of families, and returned tens of millions of dollars to marginalized communities and advanced inspiring alternatives to punishment. He was named the 2016 Trial Lawyer of the Year by the Public Justice he was named the 2016 Trial Lawyer of the Year by Public Justice for designing and litigating several landmark constitutional challenges for cash bail and modern debtors' prison practices across the United States. And he's written multiple books, including Usual Cruelty and the Complicity of Lawyers in Criminal Justice Systems, and his newest book, which we're talking about today, Copaganda, which we'll hear about today. I'm super excited about. So I'm going to set up our conversation a little bit of a frame for us to get started, and then we'll bring Alec out to talk with you all. So today, as we dive into Copaganda, which is Alec's new book, it comes at a really critical time, at least I think, in the United States. Right now, we're at a critical crossroads around criminal justice reform. And in many ways, I think that this country is at a critical crossroads in the conversation around criminal justice reform and the place that media plays in that. Our leaders are having to answer big questions around those two things. And I think Alec's book and Alec's discourse has led us to this moment in many ways, and as a great person to bring here to talk about some of these things. As a leader in this space for nearly 20 years, he has been challenging the status quo on policing, bail, and other fundamental aspects of our criminal justice system. So one of Impact Justice's core values that we have and lead all of our work through is thinking outside of the box. Thinking differently about how we tackle some of our toughest issues in criminal justice reform. And Alec, in many ways, is a great embodiment of this value that we hold. His work pushes the frontier of reform and transformation by encouraging the public to think critically and differently about our legal system. So it's wonderful to be having this conversation with Alec, but I think in many ways it's serendipitous as an organization like Impact Justice to be doing this at this moment in time. So Alec's new book, Copaganda, How Police and Media Manipulate Our News, sheds new light on the bureaucracy of punishment in the United States and the myriad of ways the media and money prop that bureaucracy up. And we're going to talk about that today. So I'm going to quit doing the introduction and let's get started. So everyone, please give your silent round of applause and welcome Alec to the webinar stage. Lovely. So good to have you.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Oh, it's really thing. People always say the pleasure's all ours, but really the pleasure is all mine and Impact Justice is to have this conversation with you and talk about both your new book, but also I think something that's not new to our society, but I think something that you're shedding a really bright light on. So I really appreciate having this conversation with you.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And also I want to make sure I said your name right. Alec Karakatsanis, is that correct?
That's perfect. Couldn't have said it better myself.
That's like as a person with the last name Aissatou Youssef, I'm used to people messing up my name. I didn't want to do that to you, so I'm proud to hear that.
When I was a kid, they would say, Alec Karakatsanis can't stand you. So anything you could say is better than that.
I'm actually, because we're live on camera, not going to tell you the things folks have said about my name. So we're gonna move on from that. And I'm so glad that I said your name right. All right, so let's jump in. So actually, before we get into some of the big content of your book, I would love if you could just tell us briefly about your book, Copaganda, why it was important at this time for you to write and to continue the conversation around how media and money shape our perception of what it means to feel safe in our communities.
So I've been working for over 15 years trying to attack the injustices and the criminal punishment bureaucracy. And I've been focusing first as a public defender in Alabama, and then as a public defender in Washington, D.C. And then after I got a grant to start using civil rights laws to kind of attack more systemic injustices across the legal system, I started noticing a few patterns. And one of the patterns that was obviously the system is incredibly brutal, right? I mean, the United States is putting people in jail cells, in cages, at rates that are unprecedented in the modern recorded history of the world. 5 or 6 times our own steady historical average until about 1980, and 5 to 10 times what other comparable countries around the world are doing. It's never happened before that a country that thinks of itself as having democratic values and as valuing liberty, no society like that has ever attempted to put so many people in jail cells. And in order to do that, you have to first build a massive infrastructure of, police, prosecutors, judges, probation officers, defense attorneys, jails, prisons, and all of the multi-billion-dollar private companies and industries that kind of surround every aspect of that. A lot of people they've heard of private prisons, but they don't understand that every single thing along the way, including in the court system and in public prisons, it's all privatized. The medical care, the people who produce the guns and the handcuffs and the computing systems and all of it, right? And so there are huge economies invested in this thing growing and growing and growing. And so that was one pattern I saw, was just the incredible everyday brutality and the way that the people who work in it were desensitized to it. And that's why I wrote my first book, Usual Cruelty, really trying to explore those questions. And a second pattern is we were going around the country winning these civil rights cases, freeing people from confinement that was blatantly illegal and reconnecting them with their families and stopping this sort of massive imprisonment of hundreds of thousands of people every year solely because they couldn't pay debt that the system was. As we were winning all these cases, we started to see a whole industry pop up around reform that was an attempt to kind of actually reproduce a lot of the very same injustices, but with new labels. And I came to be kind of obsessed with how a lot of liberal institutions, particularly liberal Democratic Party politicians, but also the media, a lot of professors at universities, a lot of people in the nonprofit world, were actually promoting as so-called reforms or solutions, things that actually increase the size and power and profit of this massive punishment bureaucracy. And the more I looked at it, the more I saw these patterns playing out every single day in news stories all across the country by the way these stories were framed. Which stories are being told and whose stories are being told, who are the sources quoted, what is the language that they're using, what assumptions are they making, what are they ignoring? And I started commenting on all of that on social media. And the social media commentary I was doing started to get a lot of engagement in the media world and just in general. And at some point, the publisher said to me, you should just turn all of these social media posts into a book. And so I tried to synthesize what I saw some of the major themes from the last few years of kind of what I think of as reactionary backlash to efforts to make the system less brutal and profitable and cruel. And I try to synthesize all of that into some basic lessons for us in terms of how we should be thinking about consuming the media and how those of us who care about a society with more human flourishing and freedom and family connection, how we can think about together combating some of that propaganda.
Yeah, thank you for that response. And I have a clear understanding of why you wrote the book. I think a couple of things that you said that were really impactful for me was one, a country that prides itself in liberty. I think one of the questions that comes up all the time in the criminal justice reform and in the work that you've done, I know, is liberty for whom? And I think that conversation comes up all the time. And I think it's played out in many ways in our country in the justice system of who we pride ourselves in having liberty for. It's clearly not the individuals most impacted by our justice system, as we see that time and time again shown historically and present day. And then I think the other thing too that you said that I thought was really important was, the idea of how we consume media, which I thought Copaganda does a great job in helping us think about. Like, media, we can't control what's out there at this moment in time, we as in the populace, but how it is we consume it, and then how we use that consumption in our lives, I think is something that we can have a conversation about, that I think you're diving deeply into that conversation through this book. So I really appreciate that in my understanding of the work that you've done so far. So I want to get into some kind of more of the content questions of the book. So in Copaganda, you often argue, and I think actually in many conversations I've heard you speak in, you often argue that the way we define and report on crime is deeply flawed. So in your book, you highlight this by contrasting like news coverage of retail theft and wage theft. You talk about the media frenzy over the retail theft comparing it to the dollars in corporate wage theft by some of our companies, which receives far less media attention and has a disproportionate impact on low-wage retail workers. So, and I live in Oakland, California, where I think this frenzy was extremely apparent in how the media was, demonstrating what was happening in some of the retail stores in Oakland. So I felt that very deeply in your work because I saw it happening. So can you expand on this example of the juxtaposition between those things and explain how crime is socially constructed and how media coverage reinforces those narratives?
Absolutely. I think you're hitting on one of the most important possible topics for anybody who cares about these issues to really be interrogating. And I just want to preface by saying, like, I'm just a random person who, started reading the news and thinking about it and posting about it. But like, I don't necessarily purport to have all the answers. I'm just going to give you some of my opinions on these questions and just in the spirit of discussion. And obviously I'm going to leave a lot out because, like, this is a complex issue. And but I think, like, for me at least, it starts by understanding what is news and what is public safety news. So at any given moment in the world, there are literally billions of things happening. And somebody somewhere is making a decision about what things are, important enough to tell you about. And when you're watching, like, your local news, you're watching like a 22-minute or 23 or 24-minute segment that is distilling all of the things that are happening in the world and telling you about just 10 or 11 or 12 of them, right? And this is already a propaganda process, because the people who are telling you those stories have certain interests in what they tell you and what they don't tell you. And they have certain interests in what background information they give you and what background information they don't give you. So, for example, I think of news as the selective curation of anecdote. Mm-hmm. So let's say I wanted to tell you a story about a basketball player. I could make a montage for you of every single shot that Michael Jordan missed in his entire career. And if I showed you that montage of all of the times Jordan missed, you might actually look at this guy, Michael Jordan, and think, oh my gosh, that is not a very good basketball player. That's not a good shooter. Everything I've told you is true. Like, I've picked out true things in the world and just put them together in a way that makes it look like he's a bad basketball player. The news, I think one of the most important themes in my book is that the very best propaganda, the propaganda that is most effective, and particularly the propaganda that is most effective on liberals, is the selective curation of true anecdotes. So when you think about shoplifting, for example, in the Bay Area, there was a single viral video, I don't know if you remember it, of someone like on a bicycle in a Walgreens and stole something and then went out. And That single video a couple of years ago led to 309 news stories around the country.
Wow.
People were bombarded with these true anecdotes of shoplifting and this panic around retail theft, even though retail and shoplifting, by all available measures, and we now know because we have some of their internal admissions, it was not going up at all. And in fact, property crime in the US is at historic lows, probably about the lowest it's been in the last 65 years. So it's like the Michael Jordan example. We have a world where actual police reported crime is at the lowest levels in recorded history, or near the lowest levels at every relevant point in this discussion. And yet people think that crime like shoplifting is going up because of the selective curation of anecdote. And I think that connects to your other question about the social construction of crime, in the following way. The police and prosecutors are doing the very same thing the news is doing. They are selecting at every given moment among all the things that are criminalized. For example, over the last 15, 20 years, there's been hundreds of thousands of untested rape kits all over the country. And yet the police have chosen to spend their scarce resources on things like drug possession. So for much of the last few decades, there have been more arrests for marijuana possession than for all violent crime combined in the United States. Police spend only 4% of all their time on things they call violent crime. It's not that like a law is broken, it must be enforced. The police and prosecutors are constantly making choices about which criminal laws they're going to look for, which people they're going to arrest, which people they're not going to arrest, which crimes. You don't see undercover teams of officers with wiretaps and things like that at private boarding schools or the dorm rooms of Harvard, Yale, and Stanford. You see it in poor Black communities. Even though the usage rates of drugs is as high or higher in some of these more elite spaces. The same is true with police enforcement of things like wage theft or sexual assault, or there's so many areas that the tax evasion is probably the biggest example. There's about $1 trillion a year in tax evasion, almost completely ignored in terms of criminal law. And so because of the police are selectively deciding which things they're enforcing, and prosecutors are selectively deciding which of the many criminal law violations they're prosecuting. So for example, I have this stat in my book. In the last year for which information was available, there were like 23 prosecutions for out of the several million violations of the clean water and clean air regulations and laws, right? Criminal people just polluting our rivers, our water. 100,000 people die in the US every year from air pollution alone. That's 4 or 5 times the number of murders. 23 prosecutions across the whole country. At the same time, 23,000 federal prosecutions for drugs, and millions of prosecutions in state and local jurisdictions for drugs. So that gives you a sense of how these concepts are sort of selectively used and weaponized to tell certain stories in our society about who we should be afraid of and who we shouldn't be.
No, I appreciate that. I particularly appreciate your last comment. Your entire answer, was phenomenal, but I also can't escape the conversation that we're not having, right? Which is how race ties to all of this, right? How we define fear in our country and how we tie crime to that conversation. It becomes a little bit easier from the status quo to have a conversation around, but all these true anecdotes of crime are happening and not having to have a conversation about who we're slotting into that conversation, right? We're thinking about crime theft of Walgreens versus corporate theft. Right? Those are two different conversations, and oftentimes conversations that are racially different as well. One is much easier given our status quo than the other to have. And I think that can't be escaped from this conversation as well.
Yeah, as you're talking, race is obviously a huge factor in all this because the construction of criminality in the contemporary mind and historically in the United States is inseparable from that. But it's not just race. There's these fundamental biases in the mainstream media coverage of crime that want us to be afraid of, obviously, people of color, immigrants, poor people, And all that should be obvious to anyone who kind of watches the news
Mhm.
and sees the images. There's the classic, example of the 1980s presidential campaign, the Willie Horton
Right.
advertisement. A lot of people don't appreciate that the newspaper that broke, the Willie Horton story. First of all, the parole program that he was furloughed from was enormously successful. Tiny rates. And actually, it was a public safety success because the more you release people from prison, the lower crime in the future. And the more family connection, other things you provide. Anyway, it was an enormous success, less than 1% recidivism rate. The newspaper that broke that did hundreds of stories about Willie Horton, and they won the Pulitzer Prize for it.
Wow.
A lot of people don't remember that part
Wow.
of the story. But it's not just Willie Horton. The other thing you have to remember about Willie Horton, not just that he was a Black man whose image was used in a presidential campaign, it's that he was a stranger. And one of the most important pieces of the local news ecosystem is they want us afraid of strangers.
Yeah.
But everyone in the police department and in prosecutors' offices, they know something they're not telling you, which is that the bulk of sexual and violent crime in this country is not committed by strangers. It's committed by people who know each other. And I have this really interesting example in the book of a couple of years ago. There was this frenzy in the Bay Area because this tech executive had been murdered. And initially it went hugely viral because they were saying that some, homeless person had killed this person. And then it quickly emerged that it was actually another tech executive or tech worker who had killed this person. There was a bunch of stuff, personal and family and stuff going on. And when it became clear that the person who had killed this person was rich, Congress people and state assembly people and news reporters came in and said, oh, well, even though this doesn't reflect San Francisco's real public safety problems, because they don't see two rich people who know each other killing each other or attacking each other as a public safety problem. It's the same as true with sexual assault, right? If we were serious about child sexual assault and sexual assault more generally, it would, and the reason for all this is that taking these problems seriously actually means confronting why people hurt each other, which would have to do with trauma and toxic masculinity and inequality and lack of access to healthcare and housing and resources and lead poisoning and all these things I talk about in the book that are the actual drivers of harm and the way people harm each other. But those are things that people obviously understand police and prosecution and jails and prisons don't solve. And so they don't want us thinking about those harms. When they want us thinking about public safety only in the context of stranger violence on the streets, because that's what they assume people want to invest in cops to prevent.
I'm like nodding to your answer because it's so resonant. In a former life, I did a lot of work on missing children, and that was a huge issue. If you remember back in the 80s around stranger danger, and the conversations like, no, actually, there are people who know each other. But so like that's one piece, and I think the other thing that I derive from your statement around that is a couple of things, which is the idea that we don't want to get to what's underneath the issue, right? Like I think so much of our work in our societies is saying that lock them up conversation is solving the issue. And I think that's because everyone's so afraid. People think that moment, if we lock them up and take them out of our society, then the fear is gone, right? Instead of getting to the conversation of how did this actually happen and what are the all the underlying things that are happening, from inequality to climate to all these things that are driving these conversations and driving it in a much wider space. That's a deeper conversation because that gets into, we all have to give something up for a society to change in a little bit. And that gets to a personal conversation that folks don't want to often do. But I think you get to partially also talking about the media, right? It's so much easier to go through the sensationalization of so much of what the media says than have to actually see ourselves also show up and how we consume and what we do with information. And I think that Copaganda gets to that in a way that's really important. And the last thing that I really want to highlight is this conversation of true antidotes. I love that you brought that up. I live in Oakland, right? Which is for folks who aren't familiar with the geography, is 15 minutes away on a no traffic day from San Francisco. It's right over the bridge. And the conversation of crime in Oakland and who commits it and all of these things in Oakland is so different than that of San Francisco. And a piece of that is because the small thing we've had, so many instances in Oakland that have gone viral in the media that have sparked national conversations of one incident that happened, whatever year it happened in, and it's really categorized why people think of Oakland as a place that's literally down the street from San Francisco, and the same exact thing is happening in San Francisco right now, but it has a different viewpoint. So I think that resonates so deeply with my experience living here.
And just there's so many factors that go into this, but it's very important to understand. I have a whole section on this in the book. The coverage of local crime and the virality of it bears no resemblance to the actual crime rates. But it does bear resemblance to important political developments and depending on in whose interest it is to highlight crime at different moments. So, there was a huge effort by the right-wing tech billionaire class and police unions to recall the DA in San Francisco. And during that period that the DA, the sort of more progressive DA, Chesa Boudin, was in office, reported crime in San Francisco was down, okay? But there was round-the-clock coverage, stories sort of leaked. And in the book, I talk a lot about the police public relations infrastructure. Who are the employees? What are they doing with their time? How are they actually getting stories to journalists? And what's going on there? There's this stuff that bubbles up from the surface, and you get to see it every now and then. But underneath the surface of the news, there's this vast ecosystem of people who are getting paid literally billions of dollars across the country every year to shape your perception. And they fomented a crime panic, even though crime was down in San Francisco under the DA. As soon as he was recalled, and this new DA was they're not talking about crime in San Francisco right now. Now they move on to crime in Oakland because they want to recall the progressive DA in Oakland. And so I show some evidence.
Which they did. Which happened.
Which they did. They then did, right? And nobody, a little dirty secret, because I talk to a lot of cops, talk to a lot of prosecutors. Nobody in this field actually believes that the levels of violence and crime in our society have a very significant relationship to the policies of police or prosecutors. Everyone understands things like Medicaid and early childhood education and poverty and toxic masculinity. Everyone understands what the real drivers of crime are.
Yeah, it's
all a charade that the little charging policy of this DA and that DA. There is strong evidence that more conservative, more punishment-oriented DAs lead to slightly more crime, but it's not that substantial because the major drivers of crime just they don't have to do with that. And I have some really great charts in the book that show mentions of violent crime in the news in New York City, and they don't track at all police-reported violent crime, but they do track when Eric Adams is running his campaign and when he's running for re-election, and they track just certain key political. When the legislature started debating criminal justice reform, then there was a spike in coverage about this stuff. So you have to understand that what you're being shown as news is often predetermined by other political events in the world and not necessarily driven by natural organic changes in public safety.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And this is, and you may not have an answer to this question, but, I think part of what you're saying is, in some ways we can't control that. The political machine is moving in a way that society should be pushing up against it, right? And how it combats and shows up in the media. But the other side of that is thinking about how we actually get people to consume it and how we create filters for ourselves around the consumption of that. So in the conversations you've been having about Copaganda, what are the things you're saying about how to filter information for yourself? Right? And how you juxtapose both the feeling of what safety means to people, and then how do you have the conversation? And we know oftentimes the things that are in media are true, right? We know that these incidents of truth that they use to prop up an argument are happening. So what do you tell people and how to filter that information for themselves to get to their version of the truth that allows them to exist in society?
Yeah. Well, again, I don't purport to have all the answers, but I do have the final chapter in Copaganda is all about what we can do both to fortify our own minds against propaganda and also together in community. And I should just note, by the way, that all of the royalties for the book are donated to an amazing California-based charity that tries to organizes people who are unhoused and tries to counter police surveillance and brutality. Called the Stop LAPD Spying Coalition. I want to say two things. First, I rely a lot on the theoretical work of this scholar, this French scholar named Jacques Ellul, who in the 1960s wrote a book called Propaganda, where he analyzed propaganda in a bunch of different societies. And one of his, I think, most hilarious and important insights is the people that are most susceptible to propaganda are educated liberal news consumers. And one of the reasons for this is that these people consume a lot of news, and news is generally propaganda.
Makes sense.
And secondly, the more kind of educated and you are, the more you feel like you need to have an opinion on everything. And so you start to formulate all these opinions on issues that are really far outside your own personal experience of the world, and they're mediated through mass media. And if you're not careful what sources you're consuming, I'll get to that in a minute, your views start to merge with the views of the sources that you're consuming. So that's, hold that thought for a second. A second observation is if you look at like public polling in the United States over the last 25 years, almost every single year, people have believed that crime was going up. And almost every single year, crime was actually going down. We're at the lowest. I mean, the crime rates are really, I showed this in the book, but we're at the lowest levels of recorded crime in modern history. Okay. There was some brief little spikes early in the pandemic of some kinds of crime, but even that is historically way lower than, but if you look at the same polls, people have a much more accurate understanding of crime in their own neighborhood. People are much more likely to say crime in my own neighborhood is not increasing, but crime out there is. And that's because they're experiencing their own neighborhood themselves. They're more accurate. They're being told all the time that immigrants and poor people and people of color are committing crimes all over. There's these organized retail theft and all of this stuff that they're consuming through the news. So when people consume the news, they tend to become less informed. That's why one of the main recommendations at the end of my book is stop consuming daily news. It's actually not making you more informed. The thing to do is to consume longer form investigative journalism, books. So if you're interested in a particular topic, you can learn much more about the history and context of it by reading a book or listening to a lengthy podcast about it, or watching a documentary, or take the time you would have spent watching your local news or reading your daily paper and just reading one article by a more in-depth source that actually gives you some of the background context that you need to understand the issue. The most fascinating thing about this is when people just consume the daily news, they actually don't retain the facts of what they're consuming. Like if you ask someone 3 or 4 weeks later about, some crime they heard about on the news, they won't remember it at all. But if you read a longer form, story article about, you actually retain the facts better. So you will actually be, in the short, medium, and long term, you're going to be more informed on the news if you consume less news and consume more sources that take the time to situate some facts in a broader context for you. And that's one of the main recommendations I make in the book.
Right now, Alec, you're getting into a data conversation, right? That's a data conversation, which goes to a lot of things, which is it's not about how much, it's often about what and what you learned out of it. So that's both a like a scientific conversation on numbers and the experience of people. So I appreciate that. I want to remind the audience that we're collecting questions, and we'll get to some questions at the end, closer to the end of this conversation in about 10 minutes or so. Tying on to that conversation, you were talking about going deep. I want to ask you about a platform that does not go deep. So in a fractured media landscape, how do you view the role of TikTok and Threads and other social media platforms as sources of news?
This is again something that's probably outside my area of expertise, and I'll offer a perspective, but I don't purport to have all the answers on this. I mean, I think it's a very complicated question. I think, like anything, like consuming the mainstream news, the experience of being on social media, whether it's TikTok or Twitter or Instagram or whatever, is very dependent on the selective curation of sources. So even though Twitter has become, a very weird and dark place full of misinformation, there are still a lot of very interesting and valuable perspectives on Twitter. And if you curate that, your feed can still be quite informative. But it takes a lot of intentional work to curate things on these platforms. And the same is true of TikTok. The experience of TikTok is wildly different. The algorithm is very, very different for different types of people. And that's one of the most dangerous things, is that by and large, a small group of people with enormously concentrated wealth and power are determining the kinds of things that we, the role that social media played in fomenting right-wing vigilante violence all over the world over the last 10 years is profound. Yeah. It just like the YouTube algorithm, the Facebook algorithms, the TikTok algorithms, they're changing the nature of how we think about reality. And so you have to be very, very careful. I think I don't want to recommend that people don't consume those things, because I think it is possible to fortify your mind sufficiently through your personal relationships with people, through reading books and other things, to go to these places with a plan and to be very particular about who you interact with and what you observe. And it can be a way of getting really good information about what's happening in the world. But you have to be very, very careful, because a lot of what's in there, a lot of what's going to be pushed on you is being pushed on you because it generates more attention and therefore more profit for these for-profit tech companies, and not because it's actually improving the quality of your brain. And one of the things I say at the end of the book is, and I think you basically said this a little bit earlier in our discussion. I think it was a really profound idea that you shared, that I'm struggling myself to find out how to articulate, but we control the stimuli that hit our brain. And that's maybe our most precious asset is our brain. And we are responsible for who we surround ourselves with, what we read, because every single thing that you read changes your brain chemistry. Every single image that you input changes who you are as a person. You're no longer the same after you've seen that movie or after you've read that article or whatever it is. You're a slightly different person. And so the accumulation of all that is one of the most solemn responsibilities that we all have, especially, if you have children or other people whose intake you're also responsible for influencing. It's a very important, very serious matter. And a lot of people, are much more protective over what their children see than what they see. Yeah. And that's, dangerous business, because we are also susceptible. And so I always think about when I'm about to consume a source of information, I think about who's profiting from it. What biases might they have? What conflicts of interest might they have? Are they trying to create a world that is more consistent with my values, like more equality and human flourishing and liberty? Or are they trying to make money? Are they trying to sell a product? Are they trying to create an artificial want? Every time I turn on Instagram, which I don't use very much, I'm getting advertisements that are like tied to like conversations I just had with someone. Instagram is not trying, like their business model is not predicated on me developing a deeper critical thinking about equality and justice. And so we just have to be really careful when we use these platforms.
I appreciate the response. I think, when you think of, the truth is that like Twitter as a platform, the algorithm is created is purposed for conflict. That is like the base level of what Twitter is. The algorithm is created purposed for conflict. That's how it engages. That's how it gets people there. What I've seen recently a lot is people doing a lot of resetting their algorithms. I don't know if it actually works or not, but I've seen a lot of people going through and saying resetting my algorithm and saying the words and the things that they want to see. So whether it's true or not, or it works or not, I don't know. But I have seen an increase of people at least taking the opportunity to say, I want something different here. And whoever's in charge here, give me something different. And I think I see that happening a lot. And I guess I appreciate it in some ways. But I think at the end of the day, kind of your big thesis around, take a big article and read the whole thing and understand all these things, you're never going to get that necessarily from a platform that's purposed for quickness in that way. So I like your challenge for folks to think about, well, what is and who is it? All right, so I know I'm going to ask you one more question because I know we have a few questions at the end. So I'm going to ask you one more question. I don't know if it's the best question, but it's a question we're going to go with, and I hope you can elaborate on it. Which is, you've been a vocal critic of the uncritical repetition of police narratives in the media, which is all clearly described in your book, Copaganda, and which is Copaganda. So what specific changes would you like to see in journalism to improve the way crime and policing are covered? And then I'm going to give you my follow-up to that. What I would love for you to answer it is there anyone or any outlet that's doing it right or doing it better than another one that you'd feel comfortable sharing with us?
I think it's a complicated question to say, how do we fix journalism? The difficult reality is that the political economy of the media is such that the mass media and the platforms that are now disseminating most of the information we all consume are all owned and operated by a very small, relatively speaking, group of people who are extraordinarily wealthy. And like I can and do give a lot of ideas in this little book. I give ideas about how individual journalists can do things differently and should do things differently, but I'm under kind of no illusion that the sort of mass media is going to make profound changes to how it's funded and financed. And the truth of the matter is that, like, if some individual journalists started doing things better, they're very vulnerable to being replaced by somebody who's going to serve power and profit more efficiently.
Right.
There is, I think, a lot of room. One thing that gives me hope and that, like, I can see happening is that individual journalists are not treating this as something they can do alone. They're starting to organize together to demand changes. So some journalists have organized to change the style guide of their publication. For example, stop putting racialized mugshots in the news. Stop using certain terms like illegal alien. Stop, like there's all kinds, felon. There's so many things you don't even ever think about that go into what language is used in the news. There are consumers, mass boycotted the New York Times because of its biased coverage in service of violence and inequality and authoritarian propaganda and genocide and all of the things that the New York Times has really been, the only word I can think of is shameful. And people are organizing to not give that money. And so but journalists inside these institutions are unionizing. They are coordinating together. None of the big problems of our world can be solved alone in isolation.
Right.
we need to come together with others to organize, to build our power wherever we are. If we're in a journalist, we're in a newsroom, or we're someone who's being targeted by the police, or like, we have to all come together. And so like I offer in this book ways that people can come together to read the news more critically, to do trainings and workshops and book clubs with people in their own community. Because one of the things that has been really exciting for me with my last book, for all my books, we give them away for free to any student or teacher or any person in prison who wants them. And I get all these letters from kids around the country, in high school or college. I get all these letters from people in prison saying, we're having these book clubs with your book. We want to talk about this. Here's something we thought, and it really inspired us. And the power of bringing a group of people together to closely read together and to talk about critical thinking and critical consumption of the news, and starting your own local Copaganda. One of the ideas I have in here is you can get together with a few friends and start your own local Copaganda watch. And you can start calling out the local newspaper. You can start going to lunch once a week with the local reporters and helping them think differently and changing some of their policies, and sending letters to the editor and writing op-eds, and putting pressure through organizing and campaigns in your own community to change your local news. A lot of local journalists have come to me and asked for help doing this because they've been pressured by people in their community. So there's other stuff people can do is they can force journalists to change the sources that they use to bring us news. So instead of having a public safety beat that just means stationing a reporter at the police station, people can help local news by court watching. And when my mother retired, she joined a local court watch program, and they just watch what judges do, and then they organize together and they report out, and they uncover all of this stuff that's happening in their own community just by watching court. Local media are now, some of them are shifting away from having a beat reporter in the police station because of public interest and pressure. They have someone covering housing court, and they instead of having like a mugshot of a poor person or a person of color on the nightly news, they have like a segment on like this landlord who is illegally evicting everybody, right? Mm-hmm. And we can change public safety coverage by just making different choices about where we look for news, and that's something that ordinary people and journalists can start doing right away. Anyway, I think those are just some thoughts. I have a lot more in the book that if it's of interest to people, and thinking about how they can organize together to change local and national journalism.
I hope it is of interest to people. I'm going to pull back my statement I said earlier about that being my last question. I actually do have another question. So at Impact Justice, we're an organization that we really lead with optimism as literally one of the foundations of our work. We believe that although we're dealing in a hard, in a hard system of criminal justice and policies and laws, that we see so much change that has happened over a short and long period of time. So we really lead with what do we need to do to be a part of that change, and how do we bring leaders to do it? And so we lead from this place of what are we hope for the future, and how do we build that future? So I'm going to ask you the question within, a seemingly bleak situation of how do we control the media and what is our role in it? What brings you hope in all this, and what brings you solace or hope in thinking about how we build the future that we want?
I think some of the stuff that I just alluded to is the most hopeful stuff for me. So every time I get a letter from like a high school student who says, I read your Twitter thread and started thinking differently about the news, and I wrote to my local newspaper, that's really interesting to me. Every time I get a letter from someone in prison saying there's a group of us that have been reading this stuff, and we wanted to know what do you think we can do to come together to get journalists to cover what's happening to us in here? Because if the public knew what was happening to us, many people just wouldn't be okay with it. Or that happens to me all the time. I and in our work, I'm constantly meeting amazing people of all backgrounds and ages, and who are coming together in this moment of uncertainty and threat and real authoritarian danger to just build relationships with each other, and to be thinking about how do we cultivate our critical thinking skills together? And so in a world where we're constantly being pushed toward isolation, like they want us at home alone on a computer screen or a phone, because every minute we're on, we're making somebody money, everywhere I go around the country, I'm actually meeting a lot of people who are like rejecting that and spending a lot of time with each other, and doing reading groups and court watching. And there's a phenomenon that's really developed in the Bay Area with Silicon Valley debug called participatory defense. And this is something that's so encouraging to me, that the families of people that are being prosecuted come together and organize and educate each other about that process, and then build a powerful community to hold their own community when people get taken away from them. That's something that's really, really exciting to me as an example of like what's possible in this moment. And I just would recommend people that like get involved in something with other people, whether it's library board or school board or court watching or a little Copaganda reading group or anything like that. Just like come together with people and don't think that you have to handle any of this stuff alone.
I second all of those suggestions, and I think those are suggestions that folks should be doing, both because they should care about propaganda, but also because they should care about themselves and how they engage with the world. So I really appreciate those suggestions, and those also bring me a lot of hope. All right, I'm going to pause there, and we're going to take some questions from folks that are listening in. So I have a first question from someone from Los Angeles that says, I'm very interested in examples of other places that talk about crime and safety differently and in a way that shifts the public literacy overall about what real safety is.
I think that there's no geographic area that I would recommend to you as doing it well. But in terms of like outlets, I think in most places that I go, there are like really good outlets that are covering stuff. So The Appeal is a really great outlet that is actually like a worker-owned newsroom that covers the criminal legal system around the country. I think that Drop Site News is a really good new outlet. Traditionally, there's a nonprofit organization called Bolts Magazine, which covers a lot of the criminal legal system in local jurisdictions across the country with really great reporting. And then there's, I think a handful of really compelling, amazing reporters at a lot of bigger outlets who are kind of part of a network with each other, so that occasionally you'll see like a really good in-depth story in major news outlets with all these reporters kind of working together. So I think you kind of have to curate at the moment, you kind of have to curate your own, understanding of there's not like a lot of national news organizations that are like doing really well. I think if you want like a global like news source, you really feel like you have to listen to the daily news, I think Democracy Now! Is quite good. The Real News Network, things like that. But I think in general, it's probably worth supporting local independent outlets instead of like your sort of traditional corporate owned news outlets. And there are lots of, in Los Angeles, they have Knock LA, which is a independent local newsroom. There's plenty of examples of this stuff in other places. So it sort of depends. There's a organization called the Center for Just Journalism, and that is a national organization whose mission, and I helped get this organization off the ground. Its mission is to help people like you find and create better local news reporting. And they work with journalists all over the country. They have a really good sense of like where some of this reporting is happening and where it's being done well. And they're actually working with local newsrooms across the country to improve their practices. And so the Center for Just Journalism is a great place to engage as well.
I agree with those. Second question I have is so much of what is driving the trend our efforts to win or sway the court of public opinion? What percentage of consumers do you think it would take to actually force media companies to change?
That's a great question. I don't know the answer to that, and it might be really different depending on the business model. So like the business model of the New York Times is very different from the business model of NBC or ABC. So like I don't think the answer is really the same. Now the New York Times, it makes so much money off the games that it offers, and the subscription revenue from that, it's an entertainment company more than anything else now, and it's different from a large network that is owned by an even larger conglomerate that has interests all, in a bunch of different corporate spheres. Like it's actually very difficult to think about whether any percentage of like consumers could sway large media companies to change. Those companies are, tiny. The media part of them are the news part of them are tiny components in a much larger aggregation of wealth that is concerned with profit generation in a whole other, and they're never going to tolerate a news division that undermines the conditions by which the rest of the conglomerate can make money. I think the best book on that and movie on that is Manufacturing Consent by Noam Chomsky and Edward Herman, which still is true. So the political economy of all this. But I do think that the more news consumers that you can get who leave their subscriptions to some of these sort of bigger organizations and entities and who support really good, high quality, independent media. One that I recommend a lot and really like a lot is Citations Needed podcast, and like people who support entities like that, or I think the American Prospect magazine does a lot of really great stuff. There's, in terms of like, in-depth news coverage on a regular basis. I think the more people that subscribe to and support entities and institutions like that, the more mainstream corporate news will become more and more irrelevant to how people are getting their information about the world. So I don't know. I mean, I think if there was a sufficient exodus of subscribers from the Times, would they change? I don't know. I'm skeptical of our ability to organize such a departure to the level that it would actually be required, given how most of these entities just don't make most of their money from news.
That makes sense. So I'm glad I had a mute button for my coughing fit, and my tears that are coming out is due to that coughing fit.
I hope you're okay.
I am. I just, when you're talking for hours, it just happens. We're actually going to wrap up there. I know there's a lot more questions, so sorry, folks. We'll do our best to get some of those questions answered later on. But thank you so much, Alec. I'm not crying. I'm tearing up because your speech, our conversation was beautiful, but mostly because I was coughing. Thank you so much for being here with us today, folks. Go get the book. It really is great. And Alex had a lot of great conversations on this book, and I've learned from everything I've listened of yours and read of yours, and your Substack is phenomenal as well. So thank you so much. Thank you everyone who attended. We'll continue to have our Impact Ideas series advertised, so we'll let you all know when we're having it. So thank you, Alec, and we'll see you later.
Thank you so much.
Bye.